So we've talked about instrument broadening, and we've talked about broadening from small crystallite sizes. The last distortion that we're going to talk about is residual stress. So this is stress within a solid sample. And this can distort the signal, but it's unique from the others that we talked about because it can do it in multiple ways. So it can distort the spectra. So it can do it in one of two ways. So it can either change the D-spacing or so both of them are possible. It can change, the peak. So that essentially that would changing the D-spacing would affect the peak position, but can also change the peak shape. And so I'll show you how this can occur in either of these two ways. All right, but first I want us to think about how it can affect the D-spacing. So what I want you to do is, in the quiz, there is an image of a lattice. So it'll look something like this, a simple cubic lattice. And there'll be scenarios where we're either going to put compression on this unit cell, or we're going to put tension on this unit cell. And it's along the Z axis. So what I want you to do is draw the diffraction peak for this 001 plane under these scenarios. So in that picture, there will be basically intensity versus 2 theta, and there's going to be the no strain or stress line, and I want you to draw the peak relative to this position for each case of compression and tension relative to this position. So see if you can come up with what each of those should be. Do that in the quiz, and they'll come back and we'll look at the result of that. Okay, let's take a look at this. So we're going to look at compression first. And if you think about this lattice, and if we're compressing it along the Z direction, the D-spacing, which is the distance between these two atoms for the 001, that would get smaller, right? So the D001 goes down. And if you remember from Bragg's law, that would mean that the resulting 2 theta position would increase based on our relationship here, right? So if we compare D to sine theta, then any decrease in D-spacing would increase the 2 theta position. So that would shift the peak to this side, right? So this is for compression. Tension is going to be the opposite, right? If we apply tension, we're basically pulling the atoms apart, and so the D-spacing is going to get larger, and the 2 theta value is going to go in the opposite direction by that same logic, and so our peak would be shifted to the left to lower 2 theta values. So this would be tension. All right, so this is basically showing the same thing that we just talked about. So under no strain or stress, the equilibrium spacing between the planes is what they call D naught here. It's at the position we expect under Bragg's law, and that means the peak is centered at that position. If we have uniform strain, then the peak is shifted. So this one we see is shifted to a lower 2 theta value. So that's what we saw with tension. because that was the result of the despacing going up, and you can kind of see that here. If we had compression, you'd expect this shift to the right of the position with no strain. And we can also relate that to the bond force diagram. So this is basically the equilibrium bond force diagram between atoms, right? So if you think about the atoms in these consecutive planes as the atoms talked about here in this bond force diagram, then when the force is 0, that's the equilibrium force. And then if we basically try to, and this is the interatomic separation, so if we try to push those together, we're basically going to the left, and that requires a lot of force, and that's what we get with compression. And so that can kind of be related to these scenarios here. Same thing if we try to get these, if we pull them apart under tension, we also have to have a large force to do that, and that's the case that we see here. All right, the last case I want to talk about is non-uniform strain. So up to this point, we've talked about no strain, where it's right on the position we expect, or shifts to the left or right of that peak. But non-uniform strain is different. So instead of a shift in the peak location, what happens in non-uniform strain is you can see here a broadening of the peak. So this is the change in the peak shape that I discussed. So not only can it change the peak location like it did with uniform, non-uniform widens or changes the peak shape by increasing the full width half max. So we can think about why this occurs. So imagine non-uniform. So the case here was uniform. So everything is under uniaxial tension. Here, it looks more like bending, right? So it's compression down here and it's tension up here. And so the material really has both tension and compression. So what that does is the regions down here under compression are shifted to the right, like we saw in the previous example. The positions up here, where you can see it's kind of expanding, so it's under tension, they're shifted to the left, like this peak here. So there's a mix of these two. And so basically, and then certain regions may not be under strain at all. So basically, you see here that they're trying to kind of show you that there's all these little peaks, right? Indicating that there's all these different sort of strains present. Tension over here, compression over here. And when you put those all together, what really occurs is sort of one very broad peak, but it really encapsulates a series of smaller peaks at different positions. So anytime you see non-uniform strain, that's going to look more like this than the case up here. That's because we have differing stress states, and they all sort of result in little shifts in the peak, which results in one large peak that's still centered around the same position that we saw previously.